Republicans dead. Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
No, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
Hey, folks, and welcome back to the Enemies List. I am your host, as always, Rick Wilson. I am delighted to be joined today by Jason Johnson. Jason is a really astute guy, a political scientist. He's a writer. You've seen him on MSNBC. You've seen him on CNN, and he understands journalism and its role in our society and its role in this cultural moment, I think, better than almost anybody. So I wanted to have him on today to talk a little bit about how he sees the press covering the early going of Trump's second term and what he thinks we could be doing better in how we're looking at this. So, Jason, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I appreciate you very much. You're my first guest back after I've been sidelined with the flu from hell. So I'm delighted to have you with me. Talk to us a little bit about where you see the media in this moment and what they're doing right and what they're not doing well.
So thanks, Rick. And I'll say this. This is perfect timing, right? I actually teach today. So I'm a professor in the School of Journalism and Communications at Morgan State University. So I have class today. So this is my class prep. I'm just letting everybody know I'm kind of cheating here. I won't really have to put together the syllabus for today. Here's the thing. One thing that I have become very aware of over the last 2 years is that our definitions of what the press is are just completely off, right? My conversations with my college students and what they consider to be the press are completely different from what you or I or even people 30 and above consider to be the press. So when we have these conversations, I think that the first mistake, honestly, that a lot of 24-hour cable and legacy newspapers and magazines and sites make is assuming that they're reaching a wider audience than they are. The press for the vast majority of Americans under the age of 30 are news influencers, men and women who are on TikTok and Instagram, sometimes X, sometimes Blue Sky, who sit in front of a fuzzy screen and look at someone else's journalism and then tell you how to think about it. So I'd say that's the first thing. We got to recognize who we're talking to, recognize who's not hearing us, and have some different conversations about, do you want to talk to those people? And if you do, you have to change how you present the news.
I think the cable model we're looking at now is still sort of the world CNN made back in the 1990s and the early 2000s, and the world and the breaking news model from the sort of 9/11 generation. And when we look at that, I mean, that's now a 25, 30-year-old model that they've sort of clipped on social media as part of their understanding of the world, but this is still a model that is basically boomer centric in a lot of ways.
Yes.
And we really are seeing now the full emergence, the full flowering of the millennial generation and and Gen Z coming into our politics. And it really does demand a new way of doing this.
A new way of doing this, a new way of recognizing how people want to consume their information. And it's not just in terms of the outlet, right? It's not like, oh, they want to see Instagram instead of turning to a cable channel. No. That's not how it works, right? Like a DVD is different than a VHS. A DVD gives you different options than a VHS, which gives you different options in streaming. Literally, how you present the information has to change. And Rick, this is a perfect example of this. So I've been teaching for over a decade now, right? When I first started teaching college students, and I was teaching political science. Now I teach journalism. But the students would come in and they would say, oh, I saw you on the thing. Like, they'd recognize me. 5, 6, 7, years in, it's like, hey, my parents know who you are.
Yeah.
My incoming class, my grandmother knows who you are. They have no clue, right? And I'm on air more often. I have a podcast, right? So I am seeing in real time how the consumer habits have changed. And if you want to take a story like immigration, if you want to take a story like what's happening today with the new administration saying they're going to stop all these sort of grants and public funding and everything else like that, it needs to come quickly. It needs to come in the form of a minute and a half with someone, a face that people can understand, feel comfortable with, and recognize, directly beaming the story into their head. They actually, believe it or not, they don't need a lot of graphics anymore, right? We used to think the graphics and colors were the thing that you had to have on the news. You actually don't need that for a 22-year-old. What he or she needs to see is a face that says, here's a thing, here's why it matters, go on with the rest of your day. And it takes a lot more production work. It takes a bit more aggression when it comes to covering a story. And it takes a realization that you may have to go back to this same story within 3 hours and update it, which is very different than how traditional newspapers and traditional cable networks operate.
Yeah, I mean, a correction in traditional news is a matter of like trying to turn the aircraft carrier. It involves lawyers and layers and layers of editorial and blah, blah, blah. Now, if somebody, does something on Instagram or TikTok or whatever, or Twitch, that reaches millions of people in that demo, I guess it's kind of expected that they will flow with the story more than try to set a single storyline and say, this is what happened. That's the only thing that happened.
Yeah, and that's the thing. So I used to do a show on Peacock. It was a sports show. I love football, I love basketball, and everything else like that. And I always tell people, when you're talking about sports, you change your opinion with new information, right? That shouldn't be something you're ashamed of. If you thought that the Baltimore Ravens were the best team in the league, and then they just stank it up because Mark Andrews can't make a catch at the end. Sorry if I'm getting too obscure and specific in the DC metropolitan area.
It sounds personal.
Yeah, it's very angry, very angry. But that doesn't mean that what you were saying for the previous 3 weeks was wrong. It means you got additional information. And I think it would behoove the press to operate more in that space, right? This is what the information is we have now, and here is the assessment of it. Hey, it changed in 30 minutes. That's okay. It's not the same thing as a retraction, right? And so those are the kinds of things that I think need to happen more often. I think that works, again, if you're interested in getting the newer news consumers, right? If you're not, if you're satisfied holding on to an aging baby boomer crowd, to an aging Gen X crowd. I mean, I'm a Gen Xer. The oldest Gen Xers are hitting almost 60 now. So if that's what you want, okay. But if you want to expand, you're going to have to change how you present the news.
I was, as a demographer once said to me, he goes, the baby boom died on the day JFK was killed. And that's the day before I was born. So I'm right on that cusp, and I get that. I'm 61 years old. This is a break point in consumption of news. Mm-hmm. The Gen Xers are, more similar to the boomers than they are to Gen Z and millennials. But with that change, I still look at the networks as having this 25-year-old model in a lot of ways that hasn't played catch up, especially given that for the fact that he is a early boomer. Mm-hmm. Trump is more disruptive in the media space by using social media and all these these phenomenon news outlets like Discord and Telegram and Twitch that the normies like us are not deeply embedded in.
Yeah, we're not. So the market's changed a lot, right? The consumer market has changed a lot. So, for example, again, when we think of universal events that everybody pays attention to, it's now pretty much shrunk down to sports, right? Like that's it. Like the Super Bowl is a thing that almost everybody participates in, even if you don't care about the game. Other than that, we don't have news moments. We don't have television moments. We don't even have movies anymore, really, because I haven't seen Wicked, right? Like we don't even have movies anymore that you can say 80% of the population has seen. And so what the incoming president has done is say, I don't need to talk to everybody. I just need to talk to my people. and then they will flood sort of neutral spaces, and then mainstream media people will think that's what everybody's thinking, right? There's no greater example of this. I'll be 100% honest with you. There's no greater example of this than the protests last year about Gaza. And I say this as a college professor, right? The vast majority of campuses in America were not disrupted. They were not.
No.
But the mainstream press cared about 6 schools because that's where their kids go, or that's where they want their kids to go, right?
Columbia and UCLA and yeah.
But if you go to University of Akron, hey, a lot of people go there, right? Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, University of Colorado, blah, blah, blah. There's lots of places. And I'm not making a comment at all about the quality or the morality behind protests or counter protests. I'm saying that the press covered it as if the entire country was on fire, right? When in fact, it really wasn't. And in the vast majority of places, I always give this example. Wayne State University outside of Detroit, right, has the largest Muslim population of any school in America, and they have Hillel. They were fine, right? They were fine. No one went there. No one went there because you wanted to talk to some trust fund kid in a Kefka in Columbia. So, this is part of the problem here. That the focus is so based on what the experiences are of the editorials, the editorial staff, and some of these anchors, as opposed to covering how the entire country is probably experiencing the issue.
Yeah, and I think that when we get right now, we saw this election that just happened, and the culture war stuff played a big factor, but the economic disconnect between media, honest answer, and I've talked to a lot of folks in the press who did not. And I underscored it myself, so I'm going to say that honestly. A lot of folks in the media did not understand. There was a great deal of anger about inflation, about gas prices, about grocery prices, about rent and the impossibility of getting a mortgage, and all these things. Now, that there is a sort of obligation, I think, and maybe it's something that these influencer generation folks understand better. They are living in the actual world. They're not folks at the network level who are, living in a relatively prosperous bubble.
Well, yeah, but I also think, economic realities are absolutely driven by partisan bias at this point.
Oh, these days, for sure.
I mean, you can't, the price of eggs doesn't really matter. I say this to somebody, I'm like, first off, who's eating that many eggs? Cholesterol, really? Like, I don't understand how that was such a thing, right? Like, I don't know anyone who eats eggs like that. I don't know anyone who drinks milk like that, right? So I say that to say that even buying into economic narratives requires a certain amount of editorial decision making, which I don't always think was wise, right? I saw all these stories being presented on the nightly news where it would be, to your point, somebody's like, well, I have my family of 7 and I live outside of Austin. First off, how many people have 7 kids, right? Like, I don't even know what you're doing. Like, are you raising a football team here? You raising a soccer squad?
That's Catholic commitment right there.
Yeah. I'm like, dude, I don't get this, but spend some time on TikTok, spend some time on Instagram, and you will see a 23-year-old who's like, yo, I'm living in an Airbnb, right? And my side job, because I just graduated from college, is doing Uber Eats, and Uber Eats is charging $47 to bring this person a salad, and I get $17.99, right? That's an economic issue that a lot of young people were dealing with that nobody really talks about. But here's the even more interesting part. It ain't just young people, right? There are plenty of adults in their 30s and 40s who have these gig economy jobs in order to supplement their income. I don't think anybody talked to those people. I think Harris did a better job from the standpoint of we need to increase minimum wage and make that a standard. But the ways in which people are making their way financially now, I think it's missed by a lot of 24-hour cable reporting. And while there are some good reporters at major newspapers who cover this, it's not consistently enough, and not in a way that, again, a lot of the public feels like, oh, the politicians are listening to me when it comes to this particular issue. There's a reason for whatever people feel about her. There's a reason that AOC always resonates, because she's like, I was a bartender. because that's a job that most people understand how much you get paid. It looks a lot sexier and more glamorous than it actually is, right? But it's also a struggling to get by job where you got 3 friends and somebody crashing on the couch.
Yeah, I do think that a lot of the appeal of Trumpism, the gateway drug to it, was the sense that the economy was no longer that working class people had been absolutely screwed, and Trump and Fox, to its great degree, managed to convince them that the reason they got screwed was that the educated classes hate them, and it's a cultural war against them, and and that people coming from other countries are taking their jobs and taking their livelihoods, and all of it was just basically a farrago, a big old bucket of lies. But that economic anger is real out there. People have been screwed. They do not feel like the system works anymore for them. And I think that's where, again, these influencer types are telling a better story, doing it in a way that seems more authentic and connectable. And maybe that's the future of journalism. It is going to be about people who don't exist in the traditional journalism world in the same way that we knew it coming up. I mean, the future of this, and you and I have both spent more hours in cable TV studios than the average human being. I mean, thousands and thousands of hits and all this, over the years. But in some ways, I think that kids and my children and my grandchildren are going to be much less, like, oh, there's Rick or Jason sitting with Brian Williams or Joe Scarborough or Nicole Wallace or Jim Acosta's who not CNN anymore, but the people that live in our bubble, I think we're kind of endangered species, I think, in some ways.
Well, here's the thing. I also think you cannot in America divorce economics from race and gender roles, right? And that's what the real appeal of Trumpism is. It's not just I can't afford stuff. It's I'm a white guy who can't afford stuff because this brown person, this tan person is supposedly working for less than me. It's not just I can't afford to get a house. It's I'm a guy, I'm a white guy, a black guy, a Hispanic guy, an Asian guy, and I can't get the kind of women I feel I'm supposed to get access to because I can't get a good job. And I resent famous people who I see on TV, blah, blah, blah. That resentment is key because people, look, there's tons of Americans who've always been poor, right? We live in a capitalist system. There's lots of people who have always suffered and been poor. It is the specific racial and gender arguments that Trump makes that sort of strengthens the frustration with that poverty, because it's one thing to be poor. It's one thing if I can point at somebody and blame them about it, right? That's where the real success comes in. That's where you can get, 55% of Latinos in Texas, voting for Trump. Right now, mind you, to be fair, a decent percentage of those Latinos in Texas identify as white, right? Even though white Americans wouldn't see them that way. But those are the kinds of things that matter. And I think even in the midst of that, and this goes to our news influencers, you had 20 million people who voted in 2020 who didn't vote in 2024. That's 20 million people. That's not just the people who've never voted. That's 20 million people who cared in 2020 in the middle of a once-in-a-century pandemic, and in 2024 said, I don't think it's going to matter. I think I can white-knuckle it my way through another 4 years of Donald Trump, which is very, very foolish. So I think there are race and gender dynamics that we always have to recognize when it comes to the economy. And I'll say this also very quickly. When you look at what's happening now, right, all of these sort of huge proclamations and executive orders to end DEI. That's completely racial. Because the kinds of things because DEI is apparently everything black. I mean, you had the military for 36 hours saying they're not going to teach about the Tuskegee
Airmen for. I mean, when I worked in the Pentagon, just outside of my office was a long row of paintings about the Tuskegee Airmen and the Red Tails.
Yes,
and I used to love it because it was like walking through history every day. And the idea, and all I could think of the other day when I read that was like, they're going to take down those paintings. They're going to pull those down because they don't tell the story they want to hear. But I mean, look, I think there's also the racial stuff about DEI. Some of this is sound and fury, right? But some of it is a systematic idea. You're going to erase history, a systematic idea that we're going to tell a different American story. And I think that is that is incumbent upon, Democrats to own up to the fact that there were a lot of things in this election that a lot of cues they missed. There's a reason why, and it wasn't as big as people say, but it was big enough of younger black men, younger Hispanic men, and a whole lot of younger and middle-aged white guys. They were activated by some of this culture war crap that is embedded in the economy argument. And they were said, it's the other brown people that hate you. Go get them. Trump will protect your job. He will take care of you. And you won't have to listen to any sort of lectures from the human resources people about, not using the N-word in the office. Because honestly, I think that's the underpinning of DEI is like, you're going to have permission to say the N-word again.
Here's the thing, Rick. I don't think white folks ever stopped. Not in my experience. I've been here for a while, and I don't know the white people have ever felt uncomfortable.
As a guy raised in the Deep South, I can tell you that.
Yeah, I don't know that it's stopped. But what I will say is that it becomes this catch-all. I mean, look, I am a Gen Xer, so I remember when it was PC in the 90s, and I remember when it was political correctness when they used the whole term, and then I remember when it was wokeness. And it's all disingenuous crap. It's all just, we don't like black people and brown people. That's where the whole thing sort of comes from. And I think that there's a way in which, and this is a key thing when you see sort of corporations saying, we're backing off of DEI, we're backing off of DEI. Here's the thing. Black people didn't ask for DEI. Latinos didn't ask for DEI, just like nobody asked Joe Biden for a Juneteenth federal holiday. Okay. What people asked for is, hey, my business should be able to compete equally with anybody else's for this government contract. That's what people have wanted. And in the 60-something years since LBJ signed the policy to say, hey, you can't discriminate when it comes to government policy, when it comes to government contracts, on average, minority-owned companies are still only about 5%. I mean, that's the thing in 60 years. So it's very clear that the impetus for these policies under the guise of being economic, they are really just racial, because you're talking about a negligible number of contracts, but that is going to have a huge impact on business owners. Like, honestly, I'm here in DC now, Rick. So I have friends who have engineering companies who do stuff with the DOD. I know people who've got, cleaning companies and they clean offices. But I know what this is going to do at the county level in Cuyahoga County back in Cleveland, where I used to live.
Yep.
I know what this is going to do in Lorain County. I know what this is going to do at local places where it's your aunt or it's your brother-in-law who's like, hey, Mike had a little trouble with drugs a couple of years ago. Could you give him a job? Yeah, I got a government contract. Right. We provide maintenance services. We do plumbing for City Hall. I can give that stuff. Is going to be ruined by these new policies. And it specifically targets black and brown people. And that's a problem.
Yeah, I think that one of the sweeping things about this, and last night I was talking to somebody who was telling me about National Science Foundation, National Health Institute of Health grants, all these other things. They're asking for every contract to be reassessed and to take out any DEI or woke provisions in the contracts. And as one person said to me, because she's like, I have a DEI thing in one of the grants that I work on. I have women in science and STEM stuff in it. It's an NIH related thing. And it's just like, it astounds me that we haven't done a good enough job as a society, a culture, as a political class, as a media class, of explaining that this isn't something where white men are put in a room and told over and over again, you're all bad, and they're beaten on the head with sticks. This is a tiny fraction of a tiny fraction of a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of federal budgets and federal resources that are in this. Is some of it irritating to guys who don't want to be told, hey, by the way, you can't use the N-word or call people the R-word at work? Yeah, I'm sure it is. But it's also sort of like one of the parts of the going rate of being a civilized society.
Well, you would think, and I'm sorry, I always look at it in this sort of Jackie Robinson examples, like how good are you
Sure.
if 40% of the competition is kept from competing with you during spring training? I mean, when I look at the impact, and I've always said this about the sort of incoming administration, and again, this is a failure of news coverage. It is a failure of news coverage to present this to people. Is that these people, they're not surgeons, they're axe murderers, right? Like most of this stuff is not going to necessarily work long term. I have a student, former student of mine, a mentee of mine. He's an entomologist. The guy studies bugs, right?
Right.
But their EPA grant to his University of Georgia, Athens, right, has now been frozen. He's a graduate student. That the impact of this stuff is so much bigger than what most people realize, and it's going to have a negative trickle-down effect. Now, smart news coverage should tell those stories, right?
Absolutely.
There's a regular kid studying bugs to help farmers and his lab is now shut down, right? There's a regular person whose job it is to make sure that we send condoms to the third world so that, sexually transmitted diseases don't spread throughout the whole world. We don't have another AIDS crisis. Their job has been shut down. That is the way in which these things should be discussed. And that is the questions that should be asked of any politician who voted for these kinds of policies on a Sunday show. And that clip should be beamed directly into people's heads on a TikTok. That's how you make people aware of what they're facing. Some people are good at that. Some people are not. Some people would like to do that, but are not being resourced by their employers in a way to make that clear.
I think that's one of the real key hits here is that telling these stories when it sounds like we're going to eliminate DEI in these federal programs, it sounds more academic. It sounds more ephemeral. It sounds like it's 30,000 feet up in the air. But a lot of the things that spin out from this affect real people, and I think that's where traditional media is having a weak spot here with Trump, and not having. And these other storytellers, these other communicators are doing a better job. So let me ask you one other thing. There is a sense of corporate fear in the media right now about Trump. There's a sense of oh my God, he might block our merger deals. He might retaliate against our corporate flagships. He might go after us. As a guy who studies this, who knows journalism and politics, where do you see their sort of responsibility as the only protected job in America? The only job in the Constitution that is listed as something that is protected is the press. What do you think their responsibility is in this moment where Trump is so much so hovering over everything and such a threatening presence?
Well, the first thing you need to do is recognize what your core responsibility is. And your responsibility is to present the truth about the impact of government policy on your readers, on your viewers, and then to assess what the motivation behind said government policies might be. That's your core responsibility, right?
Right.
And that has nothing to do with objectivity or subjectivity. It's just like, hey, this is the policy, this is how it can impact you, and this is what this man or woman told me is the reason why they're doing this policy. That is your number one job, right? If you spend too much time, and Rick, you've probably heard me say this on the air. I've said this when I hosted MSNBC. I said this all the time. I loathe palace intrigue. I don't care if Vivek and Elon are getting along. That's some French court fop nonsense, right? Like we spend way too much time. If I see another person, with a BA in psychology analyzing Trump's behavior, I don't care, right? The press's job is to say, this is what's happening, et cetera, et cetera. And when you do that, when you present that kind of information, you present men and women who can assess that kind of information, it does somewhat inoculate you from the potential attacks from an administration who are like, you're lying. Well, I'm not lying. This is what you said. This is the policy impact. Now you can try and threaten me all you want, but there's no part of this that is objectively not true. The other thing is what the press has to recognize, and I've been talking for a year now about the cyclical theory of history. You look at the 1820s to the 1860s, the 1920s to the 1960s. We're now in the 2020s. This is probably 40 years of this stuff. Most of us are not going to live to see the other end, right? But I tell people all the time, look at what the press was doing in the 1920s. we are more empowered now than we were back then, right? Especially when it comes to minority voices in this country. So it's extremely important that the press say, hey, I have a job to do. I'm going to make sure I do it in a clean way. And I am going to assume that the government is hostile. And because I assume the government is hostile, I prepare myself economically, I prepare myself legally for what I could be facing. There are too many people in too many positions on the press who are always trying to make friends with a bully. And good Lord, maybe I grew up on the wrong 80s teen flicks, but goodness gracious, the bully's going to beat your ass anyway. Why are you pretending that if you lay down, he'll be nice? Because they don't operate that way.
Capitulation it's just bait for them.
Yeah.
It just makes them want to do worse things to you than that.
Yeah.
So, well, Jason Johnson, I want to thank you so much for coming on the Enemies List podcast today. I really appreciate it. I look forward to talking to you again soon, and I'll see you either on a podcast or on a TV set at some point soon, my friend.
Cool. Thanks so much, Rick. Anytime. Love coming on.
Absolutely great. Where's your social media? Where can people find you on social media?
So Dr. Dr. Jason Johnson at Blue Sky, and then Dr. Jason Politics on Instagram. Those are the places that I am at more often now. There's still that legacy thing called X or Twitter or whatever it is. I'm still there, but I don't tweet there as much unless it's during football season or basketball season when I care. And I do have a website that I'm about to reboost, drjasonjohnson.com. So if you're looking for any of my old clips, that is there in addition to my YouTubes and everything else I'm doing.
Beautiful. Thank you, my friend. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. Appreciate it.